Yes, guys, and welcome to another video of the Canon podcast. I am now in the hosting seat. I am uncomfortable, but we're going to get through it together. Alex normally does these things, so hopefully I've been an okay interview guest. But I have a very important guest, a really great guest for me. I've been a fan of his work for quite a while. I've watched quite a bit of his videos, and I think he has a really brilliant ability to kind of relate technical skill for the lay casual fan that would like to get maybe a better idea on player profiles, on team structures. And I'm really excited for this collab. We're going to be talking Mikel Arteta, but very first, mate, Pythagoras, it's really great to meet you. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's honestly a great honor to be here. Obviously, my channel is Pythagoras in Boots. You might have come across some of my player analysis videos. We try and use, for example, Y-Scout to conduct statistical in-depth analysis of players using footage as well. We try and keep it as unbiased as possible and try not to overhype players. That's kind of like our main sort of unique selling point. We've just launched a second channel as well, the Pythagoras Perspective. That's more of a podcast style setting, which we're going to sort of cover the hottest topics in the game, more team-based analysis as well as the season progresses. So please do consider subscribing for that too.
Brilliant. And guys, so definitely check that out. But first, we're going to get into the segment right away. We're talking Mikel Arteta. This has been definitely a divisive character, I could say, in the global football fraternity. What Arsenal did was not normal, and I constantly talk about that in terms of the trust, the keys that he was given. I want to talk to you about strengths, weaknesses, and where you see him in terms of his potential as the great pantheon of managers. But the first question I have for you, Arsenal Football Club, big Arsenal Football Club that have struggled for so long after Unai Emery's tenure, you get the notification, Mikel Arteta is coming back. What was your initial reaction to the news? And then how did you see his journey develop as a coach coming from the outside?
So when Arteta first joined, I was just sort of like making my YouTube channel. And one of the first videos we made at that time was Arsenal versus Leicester City.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to laugh at this, but the sort of thumbnail had is Arteta the Messiah that Arsenal's been waiting for.
Mm.
And obviously I'm a lawyer, but one of my supervisors was a massive Gunners fan. And
Right.
we used to have like massive chats about Arteta. And I was really happy for Arsenal when they signed Arteta as a manager. And funny enough, I didn't really rate Emery. Now, it's going to sound, I do like Emery, but I always thought Emery had a bit of a ceiling in terms of I saw him as a lower stage Champions League, Europa League specialist type of manager, not someone that can go the whole way. Whereas Arteta gave me the vibe of someone who's really ambitious, really wants to be the best manager of the world and will leave no stone unturned to get to that. And he's got an aura about him where it's like some might mistake it. Well, it probably is a bit of arrogance, but I think you need that bit of arrogance to really want to be the best in the game. And I think he's definitely got that in his locker. And obviously being such a big fan of Pep as I was, and I read plenty of books, autobiographies, one thing that the Man City players always spoke about was how important Arteta was in their tactical work. And they really, really rated him highly as an individual. So I wasn't surprised that he went on to have the impact that he did. And just on a final point, we saw with Wenger as the years progressed that Arsenal became perceived as a bit of a soft team, a team that was beautiful technically, but missed the physicality of old. And with Emery, there wasn't really a change on that front. There wasn't really a culture change. It kind of just felt like it was a progression or a decline, let's just say, continued decline. Whereas with Arteta, as soon as he came in, you saw those FA Cup ties where Arsenal suddenly set up quite defensively and quite pragmatically. And it was very anti-Arsenal, but it kind of needed that. You needed that culture shock of, wait a minute, we're here to win games here. And that for me was a huge turning point in terms of the fan culture, the team culture. And I'm not surprised on the journey that we've been on since.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. I actually arguably feel that if you look at Arteta's most recent season, it actually paints the picture of our transition beautifully across our rebuild, where you're looking at Arsenal. And what would you describe Arsenal as in the modern day? I describe them personally, again, I've said it before, as the best out of possession team potentially in the world. It's built on a level of physicality in the squad. You actually look at our starting 11, they're incredibly tall, incredibly physical. It's built on a level of physical aggression and key 1v1 duels that, if you look at Arsenal's history, is actually the bedrock of all the George Graham success, and maybe where the success was built off in our most successful teams was that solidity and presence that people had in the tunnel. You look at the Invincibles, and you can really see the framework of what at least Mikel is attempting with the type of profile he is. Not necessarily the quality of that team, but you look at the best qualities of it, you can really start to see. And I mean, I think Arsenal had clearly the best record against the top six in the last year in terms of taking off points, taking 4 points off City, off Liverpool. That's impressive in a season, generally speaking. And Arsenal are no longer a team to be bullied. And that culture shift that maybe took years to degrade has really been rejuvenated with Mikel. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I'm proud of as a Gunner. When I look at it, I can sit there and I can say I'm willing to compete, and I can trust my team to compete with any team it faces. And I don't know if you could say that about Arsenal really in the last 5-6 years of Wenger, and certainly not towards Unai Emery's tenure, where I felt like, okay, there was maybe exciting individuals like Aubameyang in terms of us maybe scoring goals, but it wasn't sustainable. I never felt comfortable. It was always on the edge. Whereas I feel a certain calmness that there's a plan, there's a structure, and a willingness to compete from 1 to 11 that I feel has really needed a big culture shift. So for you, transitioning to the man that was able to do that, what do you feel are Mikel Arteta's strengths, and how do they differ from Pep? Is he just a Pep clone? Is he just simply a copying of what made Pep successful? I don't really agree, but I have to ask the question.
I don't really think that. I think he does copy Pep in terms of his adherence to structured possession play.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I did a thread on Twitter which basically tried to break up different styles of possession games. So pinball possession was kind of like what Slot and Ange Postecoglou do, where it's kind of more fast paced, bait the press and then really fire passes through. Whereas with Arsenal, it's a lot more considered and methodical. And I call that prescribed possession. And I see Pep as obviously the main sort of creator of that style of play. And I see Arteta as a disciple of that style of play. But where I see Arteta taking additional influences, I think you mentioned that best out of possession team. I think he's taken a lot of Arrigo Sacchi, in that, in terms of the back four being very solid, in terms of like the pressing being, sort of tier one in world football. I see that as very sort of Italian early 90s influences in that. George Graham, 100%. When I watch this Arsenal team, it feels more George Graham than it does the Invincibles, because the Invincibles had a very, they had that physicality through the team, but it was a very beautiful style of play. Whereas I feel like with this Arsenal team, 2 seasons ago, it was pretty beautiful, but I don't think the last season was beautiful. It was more methodical, rather than beautiful, I'd say, from the neutrals point of view. So I see him taking these influences from other, and even like a Mourinho in terms of like being quite pragmatic as well, and focusing more on the mentality as well. So these are all influences. I don't just see him as a Pep disciple. Now, in terms of his strengths, I think the biggest strength for me, and you're going to probably, some people might cringe at this, but I see him similar to Southgate in a positive way, where he's able to create that really uber professional environment. And the way he dealt with players like Aubameyang, and the way he's built like this environment where young players who are professional and committed can thrive, and they can be friends with each other and really enjoy being competitive with each other. And you look at these Arsenal team videos, and as a non-Arsenal fan watching that, I feel envious, because I'm like, wow, these guys, they all seem very committed. There's a real vibe there in the way that they interact with each other. And you can tell Arteta is really good at building that culture. In terms of a slight weakness, perhaps, is can he take that culture to the next level and make it like winners? And is that to do with his slight weakness in terms of the personnel he selects? Now, what I mean by that is, if you look at Man City's squad and you look at someone like Rodri, if you ever see Rodri behind the scenes, he's like an uber competitive guy. Like if he loses at table tennis, he's going to thrash the room. Like he's He's a bit of a mental guy in that sense. But you need these type of crazy individuals who will push the levels of everyone to make them winners. And he's Pep. Obviously, he only works with like top level players, like your Haalands and your. Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, yeah.
Does Arteta have a slight soft spot where he's looking for players who are arguably sort of been rejected in the past? So, for example, an Odegaard at Real Madrid and Jesus at Man City, as Zinchenko at Man City. Is he looking for players who weren't quite top end, but that he can inspire to kind of change the narrative and become elite with him? Does that make sense?
It's
So
one of the questions that a lot of Arsenal fans have in terms of, is he able to handle a maverick demeanor and a maverick character? Doesn't have to be the loudest in the room, but in terms of identifying his squad, you're right. He's built a squad of people maybe that have been rejected, or super young talent that he's been able to impression from young. When you look at between the William Salibas, the Bukayo Sakas, the Gabriel Martinellis, you look at those cornerstones of the team, he got them at a young enough age that, they look up to him as a mentor. And when they become the superstars, that's a question that's been asked. How does he deal with that type of personality in terms of being the best in the world? Because they've transitioned from maybe world class talent to world class superstars. And are they the elite level players of the game? That transition has a really big personality shift from a player perspective, but it's a very big managerial demand
it's
difference.
a huge demand, and it's what separates the nearly men from the winners. We saw with Southgate, and the reason why I go back to Southgate is he built a unit which has gone to finals of Euros, back to back finals in Euros, gotten quite far in the World Cup as well. So on paper, he's done literally everything nearly right. But then when it came to the crunch, he wasn't able to overcome it. And you look back at his squad selections, his team selections, and he had this tendency to pick choir boys, guys he knows will follow him to a T, and anyone that sort of didn't fit like his mold of who's easy to coach for him, he
Like
kind of
Ben
just
White.
banished. Yeah, Ben White, Grealish, these sort of players he didn't really trust, and yet these are the type of players, well, Grealish in particular, who can stand up tall in the big games and make those moments happen. And those are the type of players you need in those big games because they're going to make those decisive moments happen. And for me, like I said, it'd be interesting to see who Arsenal can sign in the last 2 weeks of the window because let's just say you get in someone like an Osimhen, that's a big character. Osimhen is a very sort of leadership type of centre forward. And I feel like a manager needs to have that scope of having one or two players who are quite difficult for him to manage, but it's definitely going to up the level of the team. Salah, for example, very difficult character, not an easy character to manage, but Klopp kind of, I don't think the relationship between the two was all, roses.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think Klopp knew that he had to have that type of character within the team.
Yeah, interesting. I'm looking at Mikel Arteta generally in terms of his strengths, and if I really had to boil it down, I know it's maybe a tired comment, but his communication and clarity of communication is phenomenal. You look at any interview that he's in, part of that aura that draws you in, he's so direct and able to translate his view of life and football effectively to the viewer. And it comes across really in every interview, in every talk that you see with players. Not only do they say, I mean, Mikel can predict what I'm going to do, but that's not enough as a coach. Anybody that's got coaching experiences understands that when you deal with players, you're dealing with personality types that are unique and varied. It's not as simple as saying, let's review the simple FIFA formation that you're going to have in this part of the play, and you must understand it. Is that clear? And it's done. Coaching is a give and go process. One of my favorite stories when I did grassroots coaching, I was trying to coach compactness of a back line, and I used a yard of string to tie it around my defenders to coach this idea of spreading out and squeezing. And every time it wasn't in unison, the yarn broke. And I said, what did you learn? That was one way that I tried to connect to my players. But you see these things with Mikel using light bulbs, with Mikel bringing in speakers of Anfield, Mikel doing different things that the media clowns him for, but secretly I praise because I look at it as a way of somebody trying to gain advantage any way they can, but by offering clarity of communication to the players so that they feel comfortable in terms of what they're asked to do on the pitch, but then given maybe a certain authority to kind of develop their own personality. So that's one of his strengths. One of his weaknesses that I struggle with Mikel at times is I do believe he struggles to implement an effective plan B when things aren't going to plan. And we've seen that derailed in different campaigns. I think he struggles to integrate the squad effectively. I think Arsenal had the most starting 11 players that were available, which could be a benefit in terms of you saying, hey, they're all fit. But really, I looked at that and says, wow, I need you to rotate a little bit better, have a little bit better effective squad management, either through subs, but even proactivity in terms of fitness management, the amount of games and minutes that he demands his players to do is
I think
quite
that comes.
incredible.
I think that comes back to George your praise of him in terms of his communication because he's so a clear thinker. It's all
Yeah,
about clarity. It's almost everything's like straight lines, right?
yeah,
Everything's like a little chess piece that has to be put in the right place. And I feel like he has to, instead of, let's just say, being a full on Pep disciple in terms of prescription, he needs to take on a bit more of an Ancelotti
hmm
in terms of being able to, at times, just throw everything in the bin and just throw the kitchen sink at it last 20
yeah.
minutes. We spoke about it in the other sort of segment that we did that's not for YouTube. But like I for example would like to see like him utilize, for example, Reece Nelson as a right back in the last 20 minutes of a game. Just think outside the box. Like, do we need an overlap here? Are we really, is everything just sort of going through the middle and we're not really making any openings out wide? Let's just throw a right back who's like a right winger who can really stretch the play, get crosses in, and we can flood the box. For example, Odegaard, can we move him out to the left hand space? Because at the right side half space, the other team has clocked on that Saka and him are both going in. White really isn't maybe in this game being particularly effective going down the right, or maybe White's injured for that particular game, so we don't really have an overlapping right back option. So we need at least a left foot on that side. So like these sort of feel for the game in the in-game tweaks. I'd like to see him a bit more, like I said, less like a Southgate, because Southgate really struggled with in-game tweaks. Can he really up his level in that and be a bit more maverick in terms of how he approaches the game?
Absolutely, and you know what? You're looking at again one of the youngest managers in the league and in the world, really, who has shown such a high level. And when I look at all these things, there's definite. I love Mikel. I can't imagine somebody different. But I want to ask you, you know, when you look at the football landscape, we've been blessed recently with top level management in terms of Pep Guardiola, who you could make the case potentially the greatest coach to have lived. Um, what do you feel the next phase of coaching looks like, and how does Mikel fall into the pool of future managers for you? You look at your Xabi Alonso, your Julian Nagelsmann's. There are some really nice, bright minds coming together. You know, Oliver Glasner. There's I'm not even going to attempt the Brighton's coach pronunciation name, but he's incredibly young. Um, the football's getting younger for coaches and for management. Where do you see, I guess, Mikel in terms of his authority in the future and maybe his ceiling as a manager? Do you see him able to become a Wenger, become a great of a club? Or do you see him more as somebody that's a brilliant rebuilder and communicator that maybe may not be able to get the toughest trophies or the highest honors?
When I look at someone like Mikel, I would hate to put ceiling on him just because I think he's someone who's so driven. His bottom level as a coach is so high
Yeah.
that he's the type of guy I can imagine thrown into any club situation, and he's going to give you a good bottom level in terms of professionalism of environment. His tactical IQ is solid. Um, he, for me, I really rate him. Like I really, really like him. I think obviously he needs to take this next step. But even as a neutral, I really hope he does take that next step because I think the hard work that he's put into this club, he deserves to win a league title. So for me, it'd be a massive shame if he becomes a Neelyman. But what I think is that even if he doesn't make the tweaks that we're suggesting, I think I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, with City, there's a drop off or this court case or whatever happens, and let's just say Arsenal win it by default, right? It's potentially that could happen. So I wouldn't write him off in that sense. I think for him to, I think there's slight personality things he needs to work on to get to that next level, i.e., being a bit more brave in terms of the caliber of players he wants to manage, taking that risk. I think he can't just stay in this sort of
Comfort zone.
comfort zone, right?
Yes.
Because if he does that, he's just always going to be knocking on the door, never really breaking through. But he's so young, he can definitely break through. Because I see a lot of managers, young managers, who get a lot of hype
Mm-hmm.
because their style of play might look a bit more sexier. Um, but in terms of the way that he's got that pragmatic element to him, that makes him quite unique. I think there's a lot of managers who don't know how to coach defensive football, and he's quite a unique outlier in that in the modern game where he is able to
It's a
coach a defense,
strength.
and that's a strength. That's a massive strength because you can't win any sport without having a good defense.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's got such a solid foundation, he literally just needs to improve his level as an attacking coach, and he's pretty much there. So there's not much to work on here, in my opinion.
No, he's an incredible person. I'm so happy. I feel so lucky that we were able to stumble upon a manager like this. As an Arsenal fan, it's my one time to eulogize about the man. I really feel that we've got a special person at the club, somebody that I feel that you can rely an era on, really. I think there's things to improve, which we talked about in this video. That's not to say he's perfect, but I look at somebody and I look at him and I feel that there's a future with him. And there's a level of reflection that he applies to every season. And there's a level of tactical change that he applies to Arsenal every season. That's an improvement. I read a really interesting stat. Arsenal have improved their points tally for the last 4 years every year. And I don't think there's been a club in the Premier League that has done it for 5 years in a row. Now, that would be incredibly interesting for Mikel to do, because I believe he must if we're going to win this Premier League. But I look at somebody who's humble enough to look at his faults, who has the arrogance to exceed at the top level. And I look at somebody who again, like you said, prioritize defensive, pragmatic football, but ultimately has so many different, arrows to his bow in terms of how willing he is to win. I don't see a stubbornness to his, or a lack of maybe humbleness to the dirty part of the game, which makes me really happy as a fan. But yeah, this will bring us kind of a close to this little segment. I really appreciate you coming on, mate. This has been an incredible discussion. I know I could talk for hours, and I love these nerdy aspects of the game. So for me, thank you so much. We did do about a 45-minute segment on breaking down the best of Arsenal: strengths, weaknesses, box efficiency, left-hand side fluidity, build-up tempo, all of that great stuff that you could find on our Patreon and YouTube members. So if you guys like this stuff, you guys can see it in the description down below. Thank you so much. Before we sign off, I wanted to give Pythagoras one more chance to plug his channel. So thank you so much for coming on, mate. And why don't you tell the people where to find you?
Yeah, so thank you. Once again, our main channel is Pythagoras in Boots. It's got, for example, videos on Ricardo Calafiori during Timber. Uh, and, it's an in-depth Y-Scout analysis using match footage that's not widely available, exclusive stats as well. And we break down each player section by section on their game and their fit for Arsenal, what would be their future best potential position and their ceiling. And then we've got the Pythagoras Perspective, which is our second channel. And our latest video is going to be on Arsenal. And it's going to be similar, like in terms of breaking down what we think is Arsenal's best 11, who would we recommend as transfer signings. And finally, our Patreon is for videos of players from, say, La Liga, which we can't really upload to YouTube. So please check them all out, and we look forward to having you guys on board.
Brilliant. And so hopefully this is a nice little preview for that video. So once you guys digest this, make sure you guys pop over to that channel, give it a watch. Thank you, everybody, for sticking through. I'm sorry I'm not the host. I'm normally the one doing these tactical, in-depth discussions, so I'm out of my depth. I hope it was okay for you guys listeners, but thank you again for sticking with us. We'll catch you guys on the next video. And remember, thanks for keeping it Arsenal. Peace.